In this video, I'm going to be talking mainly about subforms, state. I'm going to be extending from the last discussion um, our kind of form setup in terms of data modeling. You see I've got a little UI on the screen, and I'm going to be talking about the fact that I've got this little subform here of selecting a category that's really something else entirely normalized into the database. That's the sort of thing that you often need to handle, and you need to understand what Fulcro will do for you here and what it requires you to do. And I hope you don't take away from this particular one. There's a lot of complexity in this area, but the complexity is inherent to the problem. It's not inherent to the solution. There's a lot of different options here, and I'm going to kind of walk through the pieces. And categories are a pretty simple one because categories, typically you've got some other place where you edit those, you create them, and then you can associate them with things. But a parent-child relationship can take on two forms, right? You can have a parent-child relationship where this thing that's a child is either owned by or just referenced by the parent thing. So in this case, items are in categories. They probably just reference the category. But if this was a person and the sub thing was a phone number, maybe a person has multiple phone numbers, and so that has to be a to-many relation. You put it in a separate entity or a table or whatever in your database. In that case, if the person gets deleted, you probably delete their phone number records from the database as well. So in that particular case, you're interested in, for example, in a form here, if this were phone numbers, I would probably let you edit the text of the phone numbers right here and not choose a different phone number. It would be something you'd actually want to change the numbers of, as opposed to just pick some alternative version. So that's one of the central elements of complexity that gets us into trouble when dealing with forms, and there's a lot of little pieces that come along with that. How do I get the data for this relationship or whatever into my application? How do I manage it? How do I tell the server that I've updated it, etc.? So I want to talk through all of these different pieces. I'm mostly going to avoid the UI again. We're not quite to the point of understanding the data model well enough to work with UI. I highly recommend, people very often, they'll start with trying to make the UI pretty. That's the first thing they'll go with. I want this here and that there, and wrong thing to do. That's great if you're trying to impress your CEO or your manager. It's the last thing to do if you're trying to impress someone technical. Think about what you're actually doing in terms of data modeling, and the UI will flow from that. You do have to know how the UI stuff works and what your limitations are and constraints. So there's a lot to learn and a lot to know. But in Fulcro, since the UI is pure rendering, right? More than probably any other library out there, you really can declare your UI to be a pure function of the data model and have pretty much a single function run, convert this graph database into a graph of UI data and render it. And the state of that at any given second is exactly what you'll see. So there are caveats to that, but that's really what we're shooting for, and so I really want you to understand the data model and how simple this stuff is. This stuff's really, really simple, and people make it super complicated by thinking up here first, where they've got all this complexity of CSS and layout and nesting and all that crap, when in fact reasoning about it in a simplified normalized database turns out to usually be much, much, much easier. And then once you understand the data model, it's then so much easier to deal with your UI. So try to take this sort of approach and realize that all of the Clojure functions will work in Clojure and ClojureScript. You can actually play with most of this stuff at a Clojure REPL. You don't even have to start up Shadow CLJS. You would have to make them CLJC files to do that. But this is the sort of like pure data modeling stuff we can do to figure things out. So off my soapbox, here's what I got set up. Just to make this quick and easy, I did add to the depths a semantic UI wrapper library that I support for Fulcro. This wraps the semantic UI React controls and gives you doc strings for them. It's really straightforward, simple stuff. If you jump to one of these in the library, You'll see it's basically a def with a doc string that's been pulled straight from the online documentation, and then just this is an interop factory that converts the props, and then it's got the proper require to pull in exactly just the component that you're interested in from Semantic UI's NPM library. That's it. That's all these wrappers are. Like I said, I made them so that you could do something, like hit your doc string thing and actually read, okay, here's all the props without having to jump to Chrome and look it up and all that mess. So anyway, so we had UI dropdown just takes options, which is a vector of maps that have a text and a value. Right, so that's how this works, and you can say they're searchable so that somebody can start typing a name in here and it'll match things, etc. It's got lots of options. It's a really nice control. Semantic UI typically has a good number of those, and then I've just set it up so that onChange logs something and that the value is whatever the current category is. And I have gone ahead and added some model that I'm going to show you here in a minute to actually load these. So this one's in category 2, this one's in category 1, but that's not really the name of these categories. And you can see if I try to select something here, it doesn't change because I've got this as a controlled input and I'm not actually applying the change anywhere. But you do see it logs out the thing it got, and this is a big JavaScript object. So remember, this is a JavaScript control I'm using, and so when I get this, I'm going to get a bunch of gobbledygook in the event that arrives. So I have to go look at the documentation to figure out exactly what I'm going to pull out of there, but it looks like we've got target. Well, it doesn't look like target has anything in it. So we'll look at that in a minute. I'm less concerned about how the control works for this video than how the data works. So for this particular scenario where the row owns the child, there are a number of different ways of modeling this. So let's talk about the forms themselves just in terms of data modeling. So let's start ignoring the UI and look at what we've got here. So I've created a couple of different sample category dependencies, most of them not UI based. This one would be an example of how you might build a category option thing so you could use this kind of text value query to pull category options from the database and then normalize them into a category option table. Right? So if I go to my category namespace here, I've extended our model here. So we've got categories. Here are the two categories. I've got a resolver. You've seen this stuff in prior videos where I can have a category ID and it'll give me back the category. I've got one that'll give me the top level, all of them. And then I added a resolver, and this is a great example of how you can use Pathom, leverage Pathom, to pull something down into the UI the way you'd like to see it. So if I go over here and go to the Query tab and Fulcro Inspect and load the indexes, right, I can query for a join of all categories, and then I can just put splat in here to give me everything. So category 1 to tools and food. Okay, that's fine. What about if I look for category options? Well, that's the same data but with different key value pairs. So this is just a way for me to be able to compose that into a query and just have it work. And remember, these top level things, the things that they're not really top level, the things that don't have any sort of requirement, data input requirement. When I look at these, right, this one requires a category ID. This one doesn't require any input. These can be used anywhere. So I could say, all right, I want category options, and at each category option, I want category all category splat. And this will make a nested mess. But this means I can ask for the categories at the component level. So if I go back to the item, right, and look at this item query here, I can go to the, remember these items are loaded at the beginning of the application. So if I go down here and look at my initial load, right, load all items. So I'm going to load all items with this query. And I'm asking for item category, and notice item category, the way I've coded that one is, it only asks for the category ID and then the form stuff. Because in this case, all I care about for an item is the ID of the thing that it's currently pointing to. That's what's actually editable on item. That's the piece of data that item owns. It owns the pointer to the category. It does not own the category. So I wouldn't want to indicate to, for example, my data diffing that, oh yeah, well they might change the name and I want to send that name change. Now that would change the category name for everyone. So this is what it would look like to just get the category ID that's currently selected for an item. And you can see the drop downs are saying, 2 is selected here and 1 is selected here. So that's working. But that item category is being resolved from the item resolver right here. And of course, I'm faking the database here. In a real database, you might have the literal 1 or 2 here, and you'd have to, do a little manipulation in the resolver to get the right output. But I'm cheating a little bit and just specifying what the correct output should be for these. So that's a thing that I want for the form support. But here are some options I can do for filling out the dropdown. So this first part is not as much about the form support itself as about some of the complexity that comes with this particular concern. I've got a subform. What am I doing? Am I pointing to something? Am I making something that I own, that I'm editing, etc.? So one thing I could do is I could say, oh, well, give me the category options, and I can tell it not to normalize those into the database. So remember, this category options query I just showed you in the query tab, I can nest these things however I want, and this particular one, right, will just return me exactly what the semantic UI dropdown wants, right? So I could put that query in there. I can reload this, go to the database, and then you can see at the network layer, I ran that query, and for each item that came back, it had category options, right? So this is a little heavy on the network, but I can do this. This lets me pull the data that I need into the context of the UI component, and then I can very easily say, okay, well now I've got category keys, I've got my options, and so instead of making fake options down here in the control, I can just say, all right, there's my options. Oops, did I fix the query? Category options, category options. And it heals, right? So now I've got the appropriate things in here. But if I go and look at my database, what I've done also at the item level is I've left these denormalized. So I've just kind of spread categories all over my database, and this gets me back into the mess that I was in to begin with, that made me want Fulcro to begin with. Was I don't want this data duplicated everywhere. What if somebody goes to the category editor and edits food and says comestibles or something? Now everything's wrong, right? It's just spread all over the database. So this is where I could take the next step. I could say, well, all right, we'll make a category option component so we can at least normalize the options. Okay, well that's easy enough. So let's do the same sort of join, but here let's use a component to force normalization. Okay, let's reload. All right, comes in, things look fine. If I go look at an item, I already had them up. Sure enough, it's the category option ID 2, category option ID 1. If I go look at the category option ID table, okay, so now these are normalized. So, well, this still isn't great, right? Because these category options are duplications of the actual categories, right? So I have these already normalized into state. So what's another option? Well, another option is, well, don't query for them at all. Don't ask for them. Here, I need to take this guy out. And then, of course, this is wrong. Instead, what I could do is say, all right, well, category options I can pull the current state database this way. Now the downside of doing this is if I pull this here, there's no data dependency listing for Fulcro to understand, and so your UI won't refresh. So that's where this option comment here is. So you can access this map directly, and I can say, all right, well, category options is let's thread the state map through a get in, no, just a get of category ID. Right, so I've got the category ID table. That's going to be all these maps in the category ID table, and then I can say, okay, well, let's get the vals up, and then let's take those and put them into category ID would be the value we want, and category name would be the text that we want. So let's rename the keys of those things, and then we could say, well, we got the vals. All right, let's sort by category name before we do that. Okay, so crash. I thought that was going out on a limb there a little bit to type that much code. Category name is not iSeekable. Oh, right thread. No, that's not going to work for my get. Okay, so reload that. Now, as you notice, one of the issues here, right, is they don't show up until I edit. So this is what I was talking about. There's no data dependency. So Fulcro doesn't know that the fact that a category came into being should update this particular control. So the loading order can screw me up. Now I can sort of fix that by going down here. It turns out that I had a load here for all categories already going. I can put the all categories load first and reload, and then it'll at least come in looking right. So you can see this is a little finicky. So the advantage of this particular approach by dynamically calculating it in the UI, the advantage is, well, it's completely denormalized in my real database, and I don't have any problems with if something changes, this UI isn't right. But this isn't great because I've got two things I'm doing. One, I'm recalculating this every time I render a row, which is expensive. Could be expensive. Say you've got 10,000 categories. This would become impossibly slow. Horrible idea. So it's got the advantage of my data is not duplicated all over the place, so that I've got this kind of nice property of my database, but things aren't working out so well for me in the performance category maybe. Okay, so what's the next possible step? So I'm trying to show you all these options. Some of these are actually perfectly appropriate for particular situations. Like this one might be an okay thing for some situations. I just want you to see the pros and cons. I'm not trying to say this one's perfect for all situations or this one's imperfect for all situations. I'm trying to show you the potential for flexibility here that you will need in various different situations. Okay, so what if instead of calculating this for every row, I calculated this at some well-known points? Now that's relatively easy to reason about, right? If I load categories, I know that I probably need to re-up the category options. If I come to a particular screen, I might know, I need to re-up this options list. So I'd like some caching strategy. So that's the next potential thing we could do during the load, and I've already got this written out here. I'm going to put this load back after the item list load. And so this is just using that top level category, all categories. So this is getting the categories into state and normalizing them. You can ask load to do a post mutation, and you do this by symbol. So that's why there's a backtick here. So create category options. So I'm saying when you load all categories, go and run this mutation that does that thing that you just saw me do live in the UI. Make a top level key in app state called category options that's exactly the that list of categories. And I'm being a little right. I've got the vowels. I didn't do the sort by here. So if I do that, then in my database, I end up with category options being a thing at the top level. And you see this is actually, category options is actually a vector of maps. There's no additional normalization going on. This is just a root level piece of data. Now Fulcro comes with a query mechanism for grabbing this root level piece of data, and it's I think I've already shown it to you before in other videos, or maybe even here, but it's this notation. You can say a root level key and then a quoted underscore to indicate I'm not looking for something in a table. So this looks like an ident, right? So for example, you could say I want to query for category ID 2. You can do that in the UI just as well as you can in Pathome. That's a perfectly legal thing. But it's very rare to see these in a UI component because you don't know which one you want to pick yet. So that's just a very rare thing to do here. However, it's perfectly valid to say I want the entire table of categories here. Right? That would prevent me from having to do kind of normalization joins. I could just pull the table in, and then now I have a data dependency. So this is actually just a different way of doing this. I could say pull the category ID table in here, and then instead of going from the component state map, I've actually created a Fulcro data dependency here. This is really the better way of doing this. I could say get from props. I've got to be careful, category ID, that I'm not conflicting with real other things that I want here. And you see that even though my load's in the wrong order now, it gets it right because Fulcro sees, oh, you depend on the values in this table, and if those values change, it'll refresh the things that have queried for them. So that fixed our data dependency problem, and is probably the way I should have shown, dynamically calculating these from the table. Just query for the entire table, transform it, you got it. But if you decide you want to cache it, well, then the option is to use this post mutation that I've just shown you. Right? Run the post mutation, have that create a denormalized cache of the thing that you want, and then that mutation is reusable. Right? Anytime you feel like, oh, I want to update the drop-down options, you can transact and call that mutation and have it re-up the definition of those options. So caching always has that problem, right? As soon as you start caching things for efficiency, you have to figure out when you should update it. Well, this gives you a very clear way of updating it that you can then just pepper around in the places where you know it needs updating. So when you need that efficiency, you can do it this way. So lots of different options, and let me go ahead and show you this one working. So if I say category options, then down here I can just say get from props category options, and it'll be there. And again, you see the UI heal. So this is probably the most common way I do these. Is I'll put them in a cached location off of a well-known namespaced root key, so that I can just join to them from root whenever I need them and drop them into the UI, and then manage that cache of category options as needed. So for example, if I had UI routing going on the entry to this particular route, I would update my category options. I would just run that mutation. I might even run the load with the post mutation, right? I might say, dude, give me the update from the server. And that's typically what you want anyway. So those are all the possible options. I'm going to stick with this one for the moment because, like I said, it's kind of my preferred way of doing it. And so now I've got my category options loaded. Okay, so that's enough about well, almost enough. Let me say this. We've got the drop down. That's just a plain component. the various ways of normalizing them. And again, I'm not currently using these. This would be a way of me normalizing these into app state. I think I used it a little bit ago, but I'm going to remove these from the code so that when I check them into the tag, they're well, I might leave them. I'm not sure whether these will be confusing or not, but I'll leave them. Okay, let's get back to form stuff. That was a big digression to just talk about how to get options in. Okay, so let's go down here and take a look. Now, if you look at my item, I've changed it so that item category is now one of my form fields, and I've done a join between item category and the item category class, and I showed you this a little bit ago. All I'm querying for here is the form config because I want this to act like an editable thing. And this, remember, is a non-owned reference. What I really want to edit is the fact that items pointing to a particular category. So what I've listed here is that the category ID is editable. Now this is an artifact of how the diffing works. When I go to look in state, what I want to get back in my diff is, well, which ID is that pointing to? So I do want the user to be able to edit which ID it's pointing to. But in the UI, remember, this is denormalized state. So when I go and look at the nested props of this form, this says I'm pointing at category, whichever this was, 1 or 2, and this one says I'm pointing at the other one. So what this dropdown is editing is the ID. It really is changing the ID on the item category. So even though this is a nested component, so that I can, get the appropriate nesting in the tree, realize that I'm not actually changing the ID of a category. I'm changing the ID that an item is holding that happens to point at a category. So this is kind of the complexity. So if I've added these two things, I've added form config here and form config here. I've listed the form fields, item category here and category ID here. Notice that item category in the form fields corresponds to a join in the query. This is a very important point, and this is how subforms work. So let's go and configure this and see what we end up with. So if I get the query for, oops, in the wrong REPL. If I get the query for that item, I'm not connected. Let's just stop it and restart it, clear it. All right, go to that namespace, load the file, run the query. Okay, I've got the regular item stuff. I've got the item category and its category ID, and then the rest of this stuff is the query for the form config so that it can get denormalized into the props as we work, as you saw in the last video, so that we can have validation and pristine checking and et cetera, et cetera. If I ask for the form fields on item list item, there we go. Sorry, I hit a weird key so that. Then I see just a flat set. But if I go back and look at the, oh no, I don't have state yet. Yeah. But if I go back and look at the query, realize that item category is known as a join, right? So item category here is in the form field. It's known as a join. This is a very important point. I know I keep stressing it. So let's say I merge a component. Let's take an empty state. We were doing this before. So S is going to stand for what's at each step. So it starts out as our state that's the empty map. We're going to merge something and get back a new state, which then we're going to merge something else, get a new state, etc. So everything else is commented out. So I'm just going to start by, what does it look like if I just merge an item category? If I just merge an item category, it just adds a table entry. That's exactly what you would expect. What happens if I merge another item category? All right, well, now I've got two things in the table. All right, that's fine. What if I merge a component with, this state, category ID, 1 here, just as I would have gotten it from the server. In this case, notice I don't have the category name, but if I run that and merge it, you see I get the item table, I get the proper ident pointing to category 1, and category 1 still has its name from my prior insert here. So that doesn't overwrite the entire map. It's a smart merge. Okay, so now the question is, if I add form config, what does that actually do? And this is where it gets fun. So the form state follows the query across what things are declared as form fields. So item category is declared as a form field. It knows it should walk that and add config to the category as well. So notice both the item and category 1, not category 2, just category 1, because that was the one that was reachable from item 22, right? It was pointing to category 1. So it walked to category 1 and it said, okay, you need form config as well, and notice it normalized both item 22's config and category 1's config in here. Now also notice that the fields listed for the category are just the ID. Name's not in here. Pristine state has the ID. Name's not in here. Okay. The next tool, and you very rarely use this, but I want you to see it. Internally, form state has a function called update forms. It's very much like update, but it's sort of a mix between update and closure walk, right? It walks the forms via the declared form fields and joins on those form fields to subforms. And so you see right now, I've got category, item, the 2 configs. And so if I say update forms and I hand it the entire state map, you can look at the doc string here, a transform function, and an entity ident to start on. So I'm going to start on IDT, which is my item. It will walk to each entity in the database, pass you that entity as the first argument of the function, and pass you that entity's form config as the second argument. And then you have to return a pair, so that's why I'm returning a vector, that has the new entity you want in state and the new config you want in state. And so I'm just like throwing some touched flags on here. So you see that my result here would be touched true on that guy, and then I go down to item 22 and touched true on that guy, and then I look in the form config, and sure enough there's a touched and touched on each of those. So this function is actually the thing that is used to accomplish a lot of the tasks in form state, and you can write your own as well. So if you want to write something that walks the forms and does some complicated whatever, this is a useful way to do it. And you can also use it to change the config. So remember, the config has the pristine state, it has the list of things that are complete, etc. Okay, so we add form config. It uses update forms internally to walk through and add config to everything. That's the whole kind of story there. Actually, I don't remember if that's what it does or not, but some of the other things do it that way. Okay, so let's talk about what we get now in our diff. So remember that if we render this, so this is equivalent to rendering it, so let's get the tree of data that we would see in our props for our item. And so our props for our item would get past the item stuff, and then the item category stuff. The item category would get past its config, and of course the item itself would get past its form config. Okay, so if we go and do something like, let's modify the title of item 22, well, then we see that the title's updated and the pristine is still the old one, right? So these operations, you should really play with these. Play with what can I change? Well, the items in stock should be 11. All right, well, it's 11 now, but it was 22, etc. So to show that we're not actually, well, I mean, we can actually change the name of a category. So let's say we change category 1. Well, we're not seeing the whole state there. Let me take it out of DB to tree. So I can see in this table I have actually changed the name of a category. So I'm not changing the fact that I can modify my normalized database tables, right? I might have a category editor. That's not something I'm limiting here. What I'm interested in is once I get the props in a component, well, that's what I have to work with. What will dirty fields return to me if I ask it what's changed in this form? And right now I don't have any changes, so it would say nothing. So if I were to change, for example, the item in stock to 11, then I'd see, oh, well, item ID 22 changed its in stock to 11. If I then changed also its title to, other, then I'd see that in the diff. If I change in app state item 22's item category to a different ident. Now notice when we started this out, we're pointing at category 1. Right? So if I change it to 2, then my diff would say, oh, item category now points to category ID 2. If I change category 2's name and I ask for a diff, notice I don't get a diff on category 2 because category name isn't considered a form field. It's not something that I can edit via this particular form config, right? I'm getting the props of an item list item. It didn't say it edits the title. Now, if I were to go up here and simply change, for example, let's say it did own it, and so I went to item category and said, well, that's item owned category, right? I changed this where it had category name as the form field instead of category ID, right? So here I'm not changing which one it points to, I'm wanting to change the name of it. So if I changed this to item owned category, reloaded my UI, see I've got the same basic behavior here, but in terms of my state now, if I rerun this thing at the bottom, oh, category 2 didn't have config. There's another topic that I need to talk about there, but we'll talk about it shortly. So I need to add category 2 wasn't in my form set, so let me pull this stuff out of line here for a second. So it didn't have form config set up. So I want to make sure that both of these have form config. So now if I do that, pull out the props, ask what's dirty, you see that, well, you should see that. Title item category 2, category 2's name. What do my props look like? Category has, oh, we didn't get the proper pristine state. I used the wrong class here. There we go. So you see, this is a great way to debug when your things are not working right. So my category name had changed, but there was no pristine state to diff it to because the fields weren't correct. If you scroll back here, you can see that my fields in that guy were ID, right? I was still using the class that said ID was the thing you're going to edit, not name. And so diff said, well, I don't have to talk about that. That's not a form field. So now if I go do this, remember false just means I want it in the non-delta format. I could say true here and get the before and after picture. So notice here what you've got as a result is it's telling me, all right, here's what changed in item, and here's what changed in category, and oh, by the way, item category is now pointing to 2, whereas we knew before it was pointing to 1. So that's an actual diff. If instead, of course, I had changed category 1's name and did not change which category we pointed to, then my diff would say, well, my item, these two things changed, and then the category, this thing changed. So I get a very accurate diff of exactly what I want out of these subforms. So I know that was a lot of complexity and moving around, and you'll probably have to watch this video a few times to get all of that. But But at the end of the day, hopefully you see this gives you a very simple result of being able to declare what you want to track, adding the form config, and we'll talk about making this more convenient in the next video. These steps. There's a bit more twiddliness to go on. But once you have the thing set up, simply having mutations change the data leads to your validation, your dirty diff, etc. In terms of interacting with the full stack story.